Welcome to our Natural Habitat Adventures presentation today, Tracking Wild Mountain Gorillas, presented by Mark Jordahl. And Mark is coming to you live from our offices in Boulder, Colorado. Mark's love affair with Africa started in 2004 when he was midway through a master's program in conservation education and moved to Uganda. The move spurred him to shift his research focus to visitor experiences and conservation messaging. He quickly realized Uganda is a hidden gem and threw his energy into helping more people experience the country's wonders. He has since led trips, served as a technical advisor to USAID funded sustainable tourism projects, written guidebooks about three of Uganda's national parks for the Uganda Wildlife Authority, and explored the country from top to bottom. So, all this to say, you are in very good hands today with Mark, and he is going to tell us everything we need to know about tracking wild mountain gorillas. Mark, welcome.
Thank you very much, Lee, and thanks everybody for joining. It's exciting to have you here. As Lee mentioned in my bio, one of my passions is trying to get more people to go to Uganda and Rwanda. It's really just an incredible part of the world that still not a lot of people go to. If you've started expressing your interest in this trip to your friends, you've probably been greeted with a fair amount of surprise and often people not even knowing where in the world these countries are. So one of the things I love about leading these trips is that the people who tend to choose these are often very interesting people who are wanting to dive a little bit deeper into Africa. So happy to be doing this presentation and hopefully encouraging some of you to make the choice to go to Uganda and Rwanda. It's always really nice when we get to start off with some good news. And if I can get this to advance.
Hey, Mark, take your mouse down to the bottom left of there you go.
Okay, yeah, it looks like I'm going to just have to do clicking rather than arrows, but that's fine. We just about a month or two ago got final numbers on the most recent gorilla census, and their numbers are up across their range by about 200, which is really exciting. They're the only great ape species that's actually increasing in numbers due to a combination of some really incredible conservation efforts on the part of our partners at WWF and some others through the International Gorilla Conservation Program, and people like us who go see them. This is absolutely an animal that I can say without hesitation would not exist without tourism. It really has motivated the governments of Uganda, Rwanda, and Congo to protect these areas and protect the habitat of the gorillas. So we can feel really good about going there. And they've actually been dropped from being critically endangered to endangered, which is a direction that we would love to see more species move. And I want to talk a little bit about how they get these numbers, because it's not easy. They send out dozens of researchers who line up across the forest and walk in straight lines called transects looking for nests like these. It sounds simple until you realize that that's what the forest looks like. Imagine trying to just walk in a straight line through that, and they do it twice to make sure that they didn't miss anything the first time through. So very difficult process that takes months of a lot of people walking through these forests. Once they find the nests, they need some DNA samples. And fortunately for them, much like my 13-year-old son, their personal hygiene isn't great. And they defecate either on or right next to their nests every night. And the researchers actually gather the dung and then send it away to the US or Europe to be analyzed in a lab. That's how they make sure that they're not duplicating, that they know that they're different individuals. And also they're able to get a lot of information about the health status of the animals, are there stress hormones in the dung, things like that. So it's actually a very useful process on a lot of different levels. And then the habituated gorillas are very easy to count because there are people going and spending time with them every day. So they're actually able to do a visual count of those families. Despite the increase in numbers, there's still a lot of pressure. This is the boundary of Windy Impenetrable National Park. You can see that the human communities, agriculture is pushing right up against those boundaries. And again, without the massive conservation efforts that have gone into protecting the gorillas, those farmlands would have just continued to work their way up those slopes into their habitat. These are the two habitats of mountain gorillas. Up at the top there, you see the Bwindi population. Down at the bottom is the Virunga, Magahinga, and Volcanoes population. Only 27 miles apart approximately, which is not very far, but there's no gene flow between those two. That's all agricultural land between those two populations. So even though they're not very far apart in miles, they might as well be in different worlds. And they're even considering whether they should be listed as two different subspecies. But you can see there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on protecting these areas. So the efforts will continue. But for now, things are looking great. And we're seeing a lot of these little guys when we go out and visit these families on our trips. So yeah, definitely most of the families that I visited in the last few years have had quite a few babies. And, so even before we got these census numbers, I was pretty sure we were going to be seeing an increase. So now onto the trips. We are going to Africa, Uganda and Rwanda, right there by Lake Victoria, right in the middle of the continent. And to understand how lucky we are to be able to see these animals, it really helps to get a sense of how big Africa is. We're so used to the Mercator projection that makes Africa look about the same size as Greenland that it's kind of striking to realize that the United States, China, most of Western Europe, and India all could fit within Africa. It's really a massive continent, thousands of languages, cultures, landscapes, ecosystems. You could spend lifetimes exploring Africa and still barely scratch the surface. And within that massive continent, the mountain gorillas only live in a few hundred square miles right here at the intersection of Uganda, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we're really fortunate that we're able to have this experience. I'm going to be covering a few different itineraries in this talk and doing the best I can to sort of make this fit with all of them. We have the Rwanda only trip, which is about 10 days, called the Great Uganda Gorilla Safari. We have the Ultimate Gorilla and Ultimate Gorilla Photo trips, which go to Uganda and Rwanda. And then at the very end, I'll just briefly touch on our brand new Ultimate East Africa trip. This is one that we really designed it because so many people were tacking on custom extensions to see the mountain gorillas in addition to their trips to see the migration in Masai Mara and Serengeti, that it just made sense for us to put the two together. So that's a brand new one launching here in 2020. But I'll briefly touch on that at the end. This is really focused on the primates. This area that we go to is a really legendary part of the world. The quest to find the source of the Nile was an obsession in the age of exploration. David Livingstone's up there on the left, Henry Morton Stanley's on the right, and then right in the center is John Hanning Speke, who finally confirmed Uganda as the source of the Nile. So no matter how long our flights feel to get to Uganda, our trip is a lot easier than theirs were. And our journey really begins where theirs ended. We start out very near the source of the Nile. It's also just a stunningly diverse and beautiful part of the world. You see this quote from Winston Churchill, and Ugandans are very rightfully proud of the appellate, the pearl of Africa. You'll hear that everywhere you go. And both Uganda and Rwanda are just amazingly rich and diverse because of their location right in the center of the continent. And even though you think you're going there for the gorillas and the chimps and the wildlife, I can almost guarantee you that you're going to walk away being more impacted by the people. Really the warmest, most welcoming people I've come across anywhere on the planet, and they add a lot of richness to the experience. And one thing that's unique about this trip compared to some other safaris like Botswana and Namibia, where you're in these very remote parks, we have a lot more interaction with the human communities on these trips. So it's one of the things that I really love about leading them. And I really do think that it's one of the things that you'll love about being there. So we start out at the Entebbe airport there at the center. There's often confusion. Kampala is the capital, but Entebbe is the airport that we fly into. Entebbe was the colonial capital, and also there's very little level ground in the capital city, Kampala. So the airport is about 25 miles away in Entebbe, just to be clear on that. And then you see out to on the left there, out to the west, are the national parks that we visit during the trip. And I'll get into why that is. You probably for your whole life have heard about the Great Rift Valley and the cradle of mankind and all of that. Now geologists really talk about the East African Rift System, because it's not a single rift. It's a whole kind of series of rifts that were caused by the Nubian or African plate, the Somali plate, and the Arabian plate all moving away from each other. And that's created a series of rifts from the Red Sea all the way down to Mozambique. And our experience happens in the Western Rift Valley that you can see on the left of that map there. It's also known as the Albertine Rift Valley. But there will be a number of times on the trip where you really can see and feel yourself dropping into the rift. And you can see the environmental effects of that rifting process here. Those red arrows are pointing at some of the lakes that we will be passing along on this trip. And there's uplift that happens on the edges of the rifts. And you can see how that uplift just holds back that Congolese forest. And one of the things that makes Uganda and Rwanda so diverse is that some of that forest does come over the borders from Congo into Rwanda and Uganda. So you have that rich forest, but then you also have the rain shadow effect and all the dry savanna and the grasslands that come with that. So it's really just an amazing part of the world. And back to our trip. So yeah, we fly into Entebbe, and you'll quickly get swept away to hotel number 5, which is a great little boutique hotel minutes from the airport. So it's really nice after the long flight to just get swept away and be at your hotel very quickly. And it's very nice, comfortable, wonderful place. The day 1 of the itinerary, we do go to the botanical gardens, which are also just a few minutes from the hotel. It's a great chance to just stretch your legs after the flight, get outside. It is where the original Tarzan movie was filmed with Johnny Weissmuller. So you might even get a chance to swing on a vine. But it is a good idea to fly in the night before day 1. A lot of the flights come into Uganda pretty late at night. So if you arrive on day 1, you're probably going to miss some of the activities on day 1. So it's good to come in the night before. Also gives you a chance to rest up a little bit. The botanical gardens are really our first chance to start seeing some of the incredible bird life. We'll start seeing some of the primates. There's a black and white colobus monkey here. We'll also see some vervets, maybe some red tails. So it's a great kind of first chance to dive in a little bit. Then that evening, we'll go back to hotel number 5 for an orientation dinner and hopefully rest well to get ready for heading out to the west. This is where the itineraries start to diverge a little bit. You will either fly or drive, depending on what itinerary you're doing. The Uganda-only trip flies out to the town of Kasese in the west, just because it's a shorter itinerary overall, so we want to get you out there more quickly. The other itineraries drive. It's about a 6 or 7 hour drive, and a great opportunity to start seeing the amount of life that happens along the roadsides in Uganda, it's really just vibrant and exciting, and people are out there walking along the roads, and you drive through all these trading centers with beautiful produce and markets along the side. So it's a good little introduction to Uganda. We stop for lunch along the way, and it never takes long to draw a crowd. If you are on the flying itinerary, the town of Kasese is about an hour and a half from the lodge, so you will still get that experience of seeing all of the roadside life. And however you get there, it's all worth it once we get to Untitled Lodge, which is just a beautiful family-owned little boutique spot overlooking a crater lake. You can see that arrow is pointing to where the lodge is. And around this lake is about an hour and a half hike that, if the weather and timing cooperate, we usually bring groups for a walk around the lake. Not only is it just a great walk and a nice chance to stretch your legs again, but it also starts to give your expedition leader a sense of how everybody's going to do on uneven surfaces, a couple little steep sections. This is a pretty physical trip, so your expedition leader is always watching to see how everybody's doing, and this is sort of a good test run right towards the beginning of the trip. And I'll talk quite a bit more about the physical demands and how to prepare for those later. But you can just see it's an incredibly scenic spot on this crater lake. There's a school on the premises that we often visit if school's in session. There's a reading room that NatHab helped fund through our philanthropy program. And then the next morning we head up to Kibale National Park. We start out with a walk in the Mahogany Wetlands Community Tourism Project. And this is just your perfect ideal community tourism experience. This is a relatively small wetland surrounded by agricultural land. And there are about 5 or 6 species of monkeys that live in this small wetland, and they were going out and raiding crops. And the communities were thinking about cutting down the forest and filling the wetland so that these monkeys would leave and stop raiding their crops. Until somebody had the idea that, oh, we could actually make some money off of tourism, because there are a couple hundred bird species, plus the monkeys, plus just being able to experience the wetlands. So now it's just a booming community tourism project. They're training young people in the community to become guides. They're earning revenue through the project that is covering scholarships for community kids to go to college. It's really amazing what all it's accomplishing. So I'm really happy that this is part of the trip. And again, just it's so rich with birds and primates. It's just incredible. Then we have lunch at Tinka's Homestead, which is a great chance to experience very fresh, delicious Ugandan food. Most of it is grown right there on Tinka's Homestead. That's Tinka there on the right. And just in general, to ease any concerns, Uganda is a very easy place to be a vegetarian. It's an easy place to accommodate most food dietary needs. I've lived in Uganda for 5 or 6 years as a vegetarian, and there's so many amazing vegetables and fresh foods that it's not a challenge at all. And then that afternoon, we get our first chance to visit with our cousins here, the chimps in Kibale National Park. There are about 1,500 chimps in the park as a whole, and a family of 130 of them have been habituated for tourism. But they have what's called a fission fusion society, which means even though they're this one family of 130, they break into smaller groups as they go out and feed throughout the day. So it's more common to see smaller groups, even a couple individuals in the forest. Sometimes you'll see larger collections of 20 or 30 of them all at the same time. We do this afternoon hike on the first day and then a morning one the next day, just to increase our chances of seeing different types of behaviors, because they do different things in the morning than they do in the afternoons. And just, they're wild animals. You never know what you're going to see, what you're not going to see. So going out twice, you have twice as many chances to see them at all. Sometimes you get nice clear shots like that last picture. Sometimes you're craning your neck to see them up in the trees. They are pretty arboreal. They can move really quickly through the forest, so sometimes you're kind of chasing them. Sometimes you're watching them for an hour up in the treetops like this, and we all need neck massages at the end of the day. But the chimps are, a lot of people go on this trip for the gorillas, but often people leave thinking of the chimps as a real highlight of the trip because they're very active and dynamic, very fascinating social structure that you'll learn about from your expedition leader and the park guides that we will have with us. This gives you a sense of the walking through the forest. It's definitely easier hiking than the gorilla treks tend to be. It's much flatter. But we do spend quite a bit of time walking off trail. So there are a lot of vines, roots, things like that that are trying to catch you and give you an experience of the forest floor. So as you're kind of thinking about your physical abilities to do this trip, kind of surety of footing really helps a lot throughout the whole trip. But just think about how you'll do in an uneven ground like this with, having to kind of step up and over sometimes logs, sometimes vines, sometimes roots. Like I said, it's not very steep. We're not very high in altitude yet at this point, but it is definitely uneven and your legs can get grabbed by the vines. In addition to the chimps, there are a total of 13 different species of primates in this forest. So we usually see 4 or 5 different ones. These are red-tailed monkeys. We very often see these. Just incredible acrobats that fly through the trees. And just so you know about monkeys, old world monkeys that you find in Africa do not have prehensile tails. They don't hang by their tails. They just kind of use them as they're leaping from tree to tree for balance, almost like a rudder. And this is one of my personal favorites, the great-cheeked mangabey, just because I think he kind of looks like the Grinch. All right, and then so depending on the itinerary, you'll either have 2 nights or 3 nights at Untitled Lodge. If you have 2 nights, then the afternoon after the second chimp trek, you'll start driving down to Queen Elizabeth National Park. If you have 3 nights, you'll spend 1 more night and then head down in the next morning. We do cross the equator on the way down, so of course we definitely have to stop to get pictures there. And on this drive, you can really feel yourself dropping down from the eastern escarpment down into the Rift Valley, where it gets very flat, and we're on the sediment that was formed. Basically, how a rift happens is that 2 plates pull apart. You have uplift on either side, and then that erodes down into the center of the rift. So you'll be driving down towards Queen Elizabeth, looking at the escarpments on either side and driving on top of about 4 kilometers of sediment that's filled in that rift. Here you can kind of see those circles at the top and the bottom. Those are blast craters that were formed when the crust of the earth was thinned by that rifting process. And that is the type of crater that we are on when we're at Untitled Lodge. And it's actually pretty unique. There are very few places in the world that have this particular blast crater geology. And that yellow arrow is pointing to our either the lodge where you will stay for a couple nights or the place where we will go and have lunch. This is sort of the view from the eating area. Down below, it's very common to see elephants, buffalo down at the water's edge. And one of the highlights of the trip is the boat ride on the Kazinga Channel, which is about a 10-kilometer float that we do. Abundant wildlife on the sides. You can see this elephant here, very common. A lot of hippos, crocodiles. And the bird life is just amazing. You could really develop ADD because you can't turn your head fast enough to look at all the birds that just live along these banks. And another thing that makes this park really interesting is that when they formed the park, 11 communities were grandfathered into the boundaries. So Uganda really is a place where conservation can't be done without interaction with the local communities. It really goes hand in hand, and you'll get to see a lot of that on this trip. This is on the boat ride. We go by this fishing community, and I personally, as an expedition leader, I really like to talk about the conservation complexities when you are trying to figure out ways that you can protect the animals and benefit these local communities. This is a salt pan in one of those crater lakes that, if you see the sort of grid down in the water there, each family in a nearby community owns one of those little squares, and they're collecting salt out of there to sell. The landscape at Queen Elizabeth is just, it's beautiful. The wildlife, if you've been to Botswana, Zimbabwe, some of these bigger safari destinations, Queen Elizabeth doesn't have quite the same abundance that you might be used to. Again, this is definitely a primate focused trip, and the Savannah experience is kind of a bonus that we get. There are, a lot of the classic wildlife is there. It's pretty common to see lions, elephants, a lot of great antelopes, Cape buffalo. This is a Uganda cob here. So you will get quite a bit of wildlife, but don't be expecting the same kind of abundance you might get in Kenya and Tanzania during a migration, or down in Botswana. Right, and then we head down to the Ishasha sector, still in Queen Elizabeth National Park, but this is a very remote part of the park that very few people go to visit. This is the Ishasha Wilderness Camp, the lodge where we stay. You'll stay either 1 or 2 nights, depending on your particular itinerary. But you can see this is just a place where there are very few other people. It's not uncommon to go an hour or 2 on a drive without seeing another vehicle. It's a great spot for wildlife. We see topi here, which we haven't seen earlier in the trip. Some great elephant viewing usually. And then these are our main goal for this time of the trip, the tree climbing lions. Really incredible to see. And the one hesitation is that we will either see them or we won't. There are about 15 trees that they tend to climb up into, these big fig trees. And if the lions have crossed over into Congo, we're right on the border of Congo, and they frequently travel back and forth between the 2 countries. If they're not there, we're just not going to get to see them. But I would say 3/4 of the time we tend to see the tree climbing lions. And it is one of only a couple places in the world where they commonly do this, where they commonly spend time up in trees. And most ecologists believe that there's nothing different about these particular lions. It's just that their ecosystem happens to have these big fig trees that are comfortable and easy to get up into. So they think that if more lions had access to trees like this, more lions would spend time up off the ground, away from the tsetse flies, with the nice cool breezes and with a good view to see what's going on in their territory. All right, then we head down towards Bwindi for our gorilla trekking. You'll stay either in Mahogany Springs Lodge or Buhoma Lodge. Really can't go wrong with either one. They're both beautiful places right near the trekking headquarters. So yeah, it's a great, you'll feel a lot cooler here. Night times, you might even be wearing a light fleece jacket. Definitely be planning on rain. Really the whole part of the trip, anytime you're near a forest, do have your rain gear with you. Make sure that you pack and bring decent rain gear with you. This is a rainforest environment. You can see just vast trees everywhere. The forest generates its own weather systems. So even if 20 miles away from the forest, it's hot and sunny, you will get rained on in these areas. It doesn't tend to rain for very long, but it tends to rain pretty hard and most afternoons. So do be prepared for that. The first day on arrival, when there's time, we like to go visit the Conservation Coffee Project, Gorilla Conservation Coffee. This was funded initially by World Wildlife Fund, and it's a group called Conservation Through Public Health that is working with local coffee growers to buy their coffee at a premium use part of the proceeds to fund gorilla conservation and to try to put more money into the hands of the locals so that they're not having to go into the forest to collect firewood, to collect food plants, medicinal plants, because that's where disease transmission tends to happen between people and gorillas, is when people are needing to go into the forest to gather those things that they need for their lives. So if you can increase the incomes of the communities around the park, it reduces their need to do that. So it's a fun experience. You get to go collect the coffee beans, you get to put them through the pulper here, and also learn about some of the education that the organization is doing in the community. This was started by a woman named Gladys, who is the first female vet for the Uganda Wildlife Authority. And she was focused on gorillas when there was a scabies outbreak. This was about 20 years ago, that a few of the gorillas died from this outbreak. And she realized that you can't work on conservation and health of the gorillas without focusing on the health of the human communities around it. So she really has developed this integrated approach between conservation of the gorillas and really educating the communities around hygiene, around education, around reproductive health. So it's pretty amazing to have this chance to learn from them. Then the next morning, we do our first gorilla hike. And here I'm going to slow down a little bit and really talk about what the experience of trekking is, because that's usually what people most want to know and maybe are most nervous about as well. It can vary a lot. It's the hardest question to answer is, what is gorilla trekking like? It can be 15 minutes on a flat trail and bam, there are the gorillas. It can be 4 hours in pouring rain up and down ravines before you get to the gorillas. It's really hard to predict, and you need to be prepared for either one. The way it works is that all of the people who are trekking that day gather at the park headquarters. Each family can only be visited by 8 people. So you're broken into these smaller groups of 8. So with our groups of 11, we are generally broken into 2 different groups. And what they try to do is that there are people who are really gung-ho and wanting to hike as far as they can and as hard as they can. They'll try to put them with a group of gorillas that they think will be farther away. If there's somebody who doesn't want as much of a physical challenge, they'll put them in a group that they think will be closer. And the way they determine that is that each day there are trackers who follow the gorillas from morning until sundown. And then they stay with them until the gorillas make their nests for the night. They make a nest every night. So they know where that gorilla family slept the night before. Then they wake up in the morning at dawn and go out to that point and then track them through the forest to figure out where they've gone at that point. What is impossible to know is whether those gorillas will decide to go straight back towards headquarters or straight out over 3 ridges deeper into the forest. So as much as possible, we try to get people into a gorilla family that is going to match your physical abilities, but we can't, it's just impossible to know for sure. There are some great support systems. You can see here, this is how we look moving through the forest. We have a lot of support from these folks. They are your best friends out there. These are the porters, and they're incredibly skilled at helping you keep your footing. They carry your bag for you. They will literally push you up or pull you up steeper sections of the trail. Many people could not get to the gorillas without the porters. And not only are they incredibly helpful, but us hiring them is incredibly helpful to them. They only get paid on the days that they work, and there's so many in the community, so many people in the communities wanting to be porters that they have a system where they rotate through. So a single porter might only get work a couple days a month. NatHab provides 1 porter for everybody on our trips. I always strongly recommend that people hire a second one. It's $20. They will help you immensely, and it's a direct benefit to those communities, which is just, that's what conservation travel is all about. If we can benefit the communities by being there and show them that having these gorillas in this ecosystem is valuable, that's why the gorillas are still here. There is also the option, what's called the Ugandan helicopter, a sedan chair where you have 4 porters that you have a team of 8 to 12 porters who rotate through 4 at a time, who will literally carry you in a chair mounted onto metal bars. So it can be done no matter what. The past Attorney General of Kenya just trekked gorillas a couple weeks ago for his 100th birthday. That was what he wanted to do. So there are ways to do it. The Uganda Wildlife Authority actually developed that system when there was a group of people with physical disabilities who wanted to go experience the gorillas. They couldn't hike in. So that was the first time that these were developed. And now a number of people who just, maybe don't have a physical disability, but know that the hiking could potentially be too hard, have that option. So there's always a way to get to the gorillas. The thing to keep in mind, it's to hire the sedan chair, costs around $350. And if you choose to go that route, you just have to be prepared that if the gorillas do happen to just be 15 minutes away, it's still the same price. But it increases your chances. There's a lot of support to get you out to the gorillas. And yeah, we want people to get to see them. If for some reason you start out on the trek and are not physically able to make it, you will have to go back with a porter, and the rest of the group will go on. Basically, nobody can keep somebody else from getting to the gorillas. That's just kind of a hard and fast rule that we try to live by. You can see here, this is part of the hike where we're off trail now. Most of the hike, you're usually on a trail, even though it's steep and rutted and rooted. Once you get close to the gorillas, you often will break off the trail to get to where they are. The forest, it's an amazing experience just being in this primeval forest. It's just incredible. And then the trackers will radio back to your guides and let them know that you're getting close. When you're about 50 to 100 yards away, the guide will stop you. You put down your backpack, your water, food, trekking pole, and the porters all stay back. And we go forward just with our cameras and our park guide. So when you actually get to the gorillas, you're not with that whole group of all the porters and all of us. So you are in a much smaller group as you get in there. And this is a great time. Once you know they're close, tune into all of your senses, because I now can smell them nearby long before we actually get to them. So tune in to what you're hearing, what you're smelling before you get in. It really, being in these forests is a full sensory experience. Then you get that first glimpse and just you catch your breath, your heart starts pounding a little bit. Everybody talks about this as one of those life-changing, amazing experiences. You do get very close to them generally. Sometimes it will be up in trees, sometimes they'll be a little harder to get to, but usually we are quite close to them. There's generally about a 7-meter distance that we try to keep, but sometimes they move towards us in a place where we can't back away. So you frequently will be closer than that 7-meter distance. As a photographer, it's often handy to have 2 camera bodies, so you can have one telephoto and one wide angle, so you're not having to switch back and forth between the lenses. It's incredible. Even though an hour might not sound like that much, it's sort of a timeless experience, and you just really feel connected to each of the individuals in these families. This is one I just took with my iPhone, so you can see how close you get. and how gentle they are. This is the silverback for this family. And he was just leaning back against this tree, grazing, eating the vegetation, just very relaxed. The infants are incredibly playful. The infants and the adults are incredibly contactful. Even the silverbacks will let the babies just climb all over them. And it's really just fun seeing the interactions that they have with each other. We do 2 treks on the Uganda only trip, 4 on the Uganda and Rwanda trip. And again, like with the chimps, it increases our chance of seeing different behaviors. You will visit 2 different families, so you'll see different family dynamics, different numbers of infants, adults, silverbacks. And the dynamic of the gorilla family is really determined by the silverback. They have a personality just like we do as people. I'm going to speed up a little bit just because I want to be sure we have time for some questions. The Uganda only trip at this point, after your 2 gorilla treks, the next morning, fly back to Entebbe. And then we have a day room for you at Hotel 5, since again, most flights happen late at night. You can get freshened up, relax a little bit before heading to the airport. If you're on the ultimate trip where you're going to Uganda and Rwanda, we then drive down to Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda and stay at the 5 volcanoes there. The trekking is different in Rwanda. It's on these volcanoes is where the gorillas live. So rather than up and down this undulating landscape, you're really trekking more up these volcanoes. It's a little higher elevation. You can be up to 8,000 or 9,000 feet, as opposed to more like 5,500 to 6,500 in Uganda. The vegetation is a little bit more open. You get these incredible big African redwood trees. And the gorillas themselves are a little bit different too in Rwanda. You can see kind of that larger sagittal crest, that bump on the top of the head, the longer fur on the arms. So it is a different and additive experience to do 2 more treks in Rwanda. You also get a chance to see the golden monkeys after you've done your 2 gorilla treks. The next morning, we go see the golden monkeys on our way down to Kigali. Be sure you bring a really big lens. You can see, I think Cork got a pretty good shot there, counting the hairs on his face. And then we drive to Kigali, where you either fly out that night or the next morning. And generally, there's a stop at the Genocide Memorial Museum from the genocide in '94, which is a very powerful experience to have. Now, and then you fly out from Kigali. And now to just very briefly touch on this new Ultimate East Africa trip. It's basically starts in Entebbe. You just fly straight out to Bwindi, so you don't do the chimps. You fly straight out to Bwindi, you do 2 days of gorilla trekking, and then back to Entebbe. And the same day that you fly back into Entebbe, you fly out to Nairobi. So it's a pretty efficient way to get this incredible combo experience where, especially if you think you might only get to Africa once, you get the intimacy of this experience combined with the sheer intensity of this experience. So if you think that's something that might be interesting to you, I'll go back to the map. Definitely talk to your adventure specialist about it. Like I said, it's a brand new trip. We're pretty excited about it. And it really is quite a combo. It's an 18-day trip. And you get to see a lot in that time. All right, so sorry I didn't leave more time, but I'd like to open it up for any questions.
Oh, well, that was great, Mark. Well, I think we've got some good time here for questions, so I'm going to just dive right in. Of course, the most popular question, is there a best time to visit?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really nice thing about this trip. You're in a rainforest, so both with the chimps and with the gorillas. So you are likely to get rained on any time of year. And even what used to be the traditional rainy seasons are completely changing now with climate change. So it's really unpredictable, but it's right on the equator. The temperature really doesn't change much. The amount of rain might change a little bit from one season to the next, but really marginally. So it's a great thing about this destination is that any time is a great time to go.
Okay, good. Thanks. And what would you say is the average temperature in Rwanda at the end of June?
Um, so it's a big variation between daytime and nighttime, and when it's dry and sunny and when it's raining. Um, Daytime can be 90 degrees and the sun can feel very intense. Again, you're close to the equator. You are at, depending on whether you're at the lodge or trekking, you're somewhere between 6 and 10,000 feet. So the sun can be pretty intense during the day. Yeah, it can be 90 degrees, pretty humid. But then at night, it could drop into the 50s and you could be wearing a light fleece jacket. When it rains, it definitely cools things off significantly. Again, it usually will only rain for an hour or two in the afternoon, but while it's raining, it can cool off. So even when you're out trekking, it might be hot during the day, but once those rains start, it can cool off. So it's nice to have some layers. You'll definitely have a raincoat along, but it's nice to have kind of a mid-layer fleece, just something kind of light that you can put on under your rain gear if it is raining, because it can cool off.
Hmm. Okay, thank you. And are inoculations necessary?
Yellow fever is, yes. Yeah, there isn't a high risk of yellow fever in either of these countries, but Uganda does require yellow fever to enter the country. So yeah, and all of these trips start in Uganda. So yes, you definitely have to have yellow fever. I do also, definitely not a medical professional, but I do recommend malaria prophylaxis. Again, the areas that we're going to, because they're cooler, there really are very few mosquitoes. It's, if I come home with 2 mosquito bites, I feel like that was a bad trip. But there are areas, especially when we're down in Queen Elizabeth, where malaria does exist. And unless you have a medical reason not to take the prophylaxis, I recommend do take the malaria meds. But that's it. Nothing else is required.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Thank you. So the support systems, the extra porters that you mentioned, are those same support systems available for the Rwanda trip?
Yes. Yep, definitely.
All right.
And it
Okay,
can
good.
also be arranged for the chimp trekking. It's just not done as commonly because it's not quite as challenging terrain.
Mm, okay, good to know. All right. I have a photography question for you. Is a monopod
Oh,
helpful for the Buwindi gorilla trek? Should I plan to keep my camera packed until I reach the gorillas or keep it accessible while hiking? So two questions there.
right. So I might have missed the first because I was saying I'm not a photography guy, but that definitely the one about whether to keep it accessible or not, I can answer that pretty much no, unless I've had people on trips who are really into taking pictures of the mushrooms and the mosses and all of the kind of abundance of vegetation that we're surrounded by. But if you're really focused on the animals, you really won't need it out and accessible until you get to the gorillas. And again, your porter will carry that for you. So you don't even have to worry about the extra weight. And the porters are incredibly strong. They could literally carry your camera and you all the way to the gorillas and barely break a sweat.
Okay, good to know. The monopod was the other part of that question.
Yeah, a lot of people actually like using, well, okay, so you won't be allowed to bring the monopod into where the mountain gorillas are. It's hard for the gorillas to tell the difference between a tripod, a walking stick, a monopod, and a gun. So because, especially on the Congo side and in the past, there have been poaching issues, they are sensitive to that, and they don't want the gorillas to get comfortable with something that looks like a gun, because then if there are issues with poaching in the future, they won't, they want the gorillas to be afraid of things like that. So yeah, you can bring it for the hike. A lot of people do use those instead of a walking stick, both for chimps and for the gorillas. Again, if you want to be taking forest photography, but you won't be allowed to bring it into the gorillas.
Okay, all right, thank you. Can you talk a little more specifically about what attire people need to bring along with them?
Yeah. Um, So comfortable hiking clothes, light pants, zip-off pants are great. And like a light nylon that's quick drying is really good. And then on your upper body, I really like to have just a light long sleeve, like the ex officio or the Craig Hopper shirts that we have in the gear store here. Something that you can roll down to your wrists for when you're hiking off trail, that last bit when you're trying to get to the gorillas or the chimps. It can be really helpful against the vegetation. You don't want something that's too heavy or too hot, because again, the trekking, if it's not raining, it can be pretty warm. Then again, you want to have sort of a light mid layer. Just as for a reference, the R1 that we have in the gear store is a Patagonia mid-weight fleece. Something like that is really nice to have if it does get cold in the afternoon, if it's raining. And then a good waterproof shell. Gore-Tex is fine for this kind of a trip. You don't need heavy duty rubber or anything like that. But you don't want a really light, cheap plastic raincoat, partly because it doesn't breathe, so you're going to sweat like crazy, but also those can snag on the branches and tear. So you want something that's good quality, that breathes, and that is truly waterproof, not water resistant. And another thing that I would recommend is a pack cover for your backpack. Just again, if it's raining and your camera's inside it, you want to protect it from the rain. And then boots. Boots are incredibly important. Make sure your boots are broken in. Make sure that they have some tread on the bottom. I've had people who came with brand new leather boots that they had never worn before, and they were just crippled by them. So make sure your boots are comfortable. And on that note, in terms of preparing physically for the trip, get out hiking in the boots that you're planning to wear. Gore-Tex boots are great because again, it can be wet in the forest. And practice hiking on uneven terrain, and if you can find it, some steep hillsides. If you go for a 3 or 5 mile walk every day, but it's at 0 feet elevation on perfectly level ground, you are increasing your general fitness level, but you're not necessarily preparing yourself for the gorilla trekking experience. You really want to practice on uneven ground and steep if you can. And the elevation is a factor. We generally hike pretty slowly, so I would say the elevation isn't a huge factor. It's really more practicing so that you have good, sure footing.
Okay, good. Well, I think we're going to stop there. This has just been terrific. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom and sharing that with us today. So let me turn it back over to you now, Mark, for closing comments.
All right. Yeah. I've kind of said this over and over throughout the presentation, but seeing the gorillas is a very unique wildlife experience. There are very few experiences you can have that are this intimate. You are feet away from an animal that's really so close to us, genetically, biologically, and socially. Their family dynamics are so much like ours. Their lifespan isn't that much different from ours. I often sit there and I can imagine myself living out in that forest just because I feel so connected to them when I'm out there. Another thing I would like to really emphasize is when you're out there with the gorillas, it can be really hard not to spend the whole hour behind your camera, but make sure you spend at least 10 minutes, put the camera to the side, and just sink into the experience of being there. It really is a unique experience. You very rarely get to be this close to an animal that is both so powerful and so gentle, and so connected to us. So I really hope that all of you on this call end up going on a gorilla trip at some point. It is just, it's not your typical safari experience. So I think that's what I'll end with.
Thank you so much, Mark. And everyone, we appreciate you. If we didn't get to your question, we've got a log of those and we will do our best to answer all. And we will also send you all a link to the replay. So again, we thank you for being with us, and this will conclude our webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.